Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. I'm your host, Jacob Kyle, and I'm here today with Judith Blackstone. Judith developed the realization process, a method of embodied psychological and relational healing and non-dual spiritual awakening. She is the author of Trauma and the Unbound Body, which just came out on December 1st, 2018, Belonging Here, The Enlightenment Process, The Intimate Life, and The Empathic Ground. An audio series of the realization process is available from Sounds True. So with that, hello, Judith. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I just want to offer a little disclaimer to our listeners. Judith already knows this, but I am working on 3 hours sleep, so I may be a little slow, but I'm going to do my very best, and hopefully we'll come out with a dynamic conversation. At least we know Judith will be dynamic, and that's the important thing. So, Judith, I would love to hear a little bit about your story just to start off, and what has led you to the work that you do in embodied non-duality, which is a topic we're going to explore a lot today.
Mm. Okay, well, that's a long story, of course, but the bottom line is I had been a professional dancer as a child and as a young woman, and I injured my back very badly, and I needed to find a way to heal it. And that started my journey. Body workers, psychotherapists, healers of all stripes, and finally realized, out of desperation, that I needed to cultivate a very, very fine inward focus in order to let go of myself on a level where I could get relief for that injury. And then I began my spiritual journey and realized to a large extent that what I was experiencing, and by the way, I had dance students coming, that's how I was earning a living, so I was teaching them everything that I discovered in my own healing process. And then I got to Buddhism, to Hinduism, and realized that there was a lot of correlation between what I had already been exploring and what people had been knowing and teaching for many, many, many years, and that, of course, brought a lot of enrichment, clarity to what I was experiencing and teaching.
Now, the kind of fundamental trauma that you're talking about, the physical injury, was, I understand, when I was listening to the Liberated Body interview, and a beautiful interview, and you talked about it being a kind of fused, the doctors suggested that you get your spine fused. Is that correct?
Yes.
So when you were in that kind of, your own somatic work, were you just doing your own kind of spontaneous, subtle exploration based on your own kind of knowledge through dance, or were you working with some kind of meditation practice at that point?
Oh, I was working on my own. I was quite on my own, but I had explored various bodywork techniques, and there were a couple of places where I really learned something. For example, I learned from a woman I was doing Alexander technique with. She was doing her own version of it, a little bit different than classical Alexander technique, and she was teaching how you could, and working with me in a way where she put her hand on the tension and felt the directionality of the arrested energy within the tension and gave it just a little bit of nudge, and then it would continue on its line and then release. I learned tremendous amount about that, and that really became a basis for the self-healing work that then I later did with myself and taught. I got a book I think it was called Tantric Meditation, with illustrations and all kinds of stuff. Let me say, this is in the 70s, and right, early 70s. And there wasn't that much, you could browse around. But I began experimenting with that, all in the service of making deeper, more inward contact with myself. I was in a back brace for 6 months, and of course, I had been a dancer, so I was used to a lot of movement and agility. And I began to feel that, there's this very internal kind of movement, more and more and more subtle. Now, not yet the ground that I was to finally arrive at and teach, fundamental consciousness, but more and more subtle levels of attunement inward that kind of prepared for that.
Mm. So when you when you were working with this Alexander Technique person, were you able, obviously, as I understand it, I don't know a lot about this kind of surgery, but I imagine it's, fusing means frozen in the sense like there's no movement. So were you able to find like some kind of fluidity there, or was it really your relationship with that space that became more fluid?
No, there's no relationship with that kind of density, except please go away.
Yeah, right.
So, but I learned a tremendous amount from it, and I did finally get fluidity through it, um, and more, But I learned a tremendous amount from it because basically there was fusion that was in the lower spine, and it was just like having a little bit of brick there,
Yeah.
it was untenable. It was not something I could live with or come into a relationship with or encompass. But I did learn that having a little bit of brick density somewhere in the body then creates the same density everywhere in the body that we're made in that kind of mirror way. It's really, I think, closest to fractal geometry, to self-similarity, but we're made so that if there's a tension in one little part of the body, it's going to be mirrored in every part of the body. So all kinds of very interesting things, but the most important thing about that process, that healing process, and the bulk of it took about 10 years, was that I discovered the more and more subtle ways that we can experience ourselves, and as a consequence, the world around us.
So it turned out to be quite the gift then.
Yes, finally.
I mean, I feel like it is sort of these injuries that we learn the most from, right? They encourage us towards kind of degrees of subtle awareness that, if we were just kind of in our physical prime and the kind of physical aptitude that we have from childhood on, if that just continued, maybe we wouldn't ever get to these, more mature sort of realizations, not just, age-wise, but just embodiment-wise. So, with that, we can move into kind of this concept that you explore, and one of your talks for the Science and Non-Duality Conference was Embodied Non-Duality. And, these two words, the words that are part of this concept, embodiment and non-duality, are, of course, very popular. There's Embodied Philosophy, which is the name of this website. There's so many embodied, even though when I created Embodied Philosophy, I swear there weren't as many. I'm just saying.
Me too.
So it's happening everywhere now, and this work, I mean, it's great. We're thinking about the body. So I want to kind of take these two terms in turn, and then we'll put them together. But, what does embodiment mean to you? Obviously, we have a body, but what does it mean to be embodied in the sense that you're unpacking it for us?
Yeah, very good. Very good question. Very important because it's used in different ways. And for example, sometimes embodied cognition as a term is used just that the body supports cognition and guides it in a way.
Yeah.
And then we have a kind of connection between the body and the mind. Well, of course, for people who don't have very much at all connection between the body and the mind, that's important, to become more and more aware of the body. But this is a step further than being aware of. It's actually living within the body. It's quite a different experience. It feels like one is conscious everywhere in the body. And because of that, it feels like you are made of consciousness. So it can be described as true body-mind integration, oneness.
Beautiful. So then, I mean, that obviously then connects quite easily. We can see it segueing nicely into the concept of non-duality, which of course, again, is a very popular word right now, and everyone wants to be acting and interacting with the world non-dually, which of course, to me, is always, it strikes me a little bit as paradoxical because, the relations of the world are in some sense dual because you have a subject and you have an object. So, so what does non-duality mean for you in the sense of embodied non-duality?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There's so many different types of non-duality. Frankly, I think the term has been embraced in part so that people like myself who are teaching very subtle spiritual work don't have to call ourselves spiritual teachers, which has so much baggage attached to it,
I see.
and I think that's a great step in our society, that, we're not worshiping photographs of people necessarily, and all of that, but that peers can teach what they have experienced to other people, to peers. So I embrace that term, but what it means to me is not an erasing of either the subject or the object, but an actual continuity of subject and object. When we uncover ourselves, which we can, as this very, very subtle consciousness, which I've already talked about as what we can experience in our whole body and as our whole body, when we attune to that, or realize ourselves as that, we experience that same very subtle consciousness, which I call fundamental consciousness, pervading not just our whole body, but our environment at the same time. And what that means is that the oneness is a oneness of the space that pervades me and the oneness that pervades my environment. That fundamental consciousness pervading my body gives me a palpable sense of my own internal unity, internal wholeness. It reveals the basic, what seem to be innate qualities of humanness, that we all share: love, intelligence, pleasure, power, the basic qualities. So it gives me a sense of truly existing as a separate person, and also reveals the changing dynamic, growing, learning, and so forth that make up my unique personality and everybody's unique personality. But at the same time that this very fine consciousness pervades me, it pervades the environment. And that means that oneness includes this separate being and your separate being, so that we can really even get a sense of that, your uniqueness, my uniqueness, and at the same time experience ourselves as made of the same unified ground.
That's beautiful. I mean, that resonates on a lot of levels and so I'm wondering kind of because I hear that there's a sense of separateness that you're describing that is interconnected, but there is a sense in which, when I was listening to one of your talks, or maybe it was in the interview, that you described this more kind of cosmic body, right? So there's a kind of sense in which we are a part of a larger collective body, and then we also have this separateness. So I'm not quite sure here's where the tiredness is coming in. I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I'm wondering what the relationship is to that, because this also came up when I was reading your psychoanalytic article, and I found it a little interesting that you sort of you were sort of emphasizing the existence as a separate being, because of course a lot of non-dual teachings are emphasizing the non-separateness of everything. So maybe a better question is, what is more fruitful about the separate in non-separateness versus kind of just dissolving the separate self altogether?
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, one reason, of course, that I'm emphasizing in my work the separate being as being continuous with this oneness is because so many non-dual teachers say that you don't exist, and I feel like that's misleading and destructive in so many different ways, or at least two main different ways. I was also in the psychoanalytic article that you're referring to, emphasizing the fruition of the separate being that occurs, the maturity of the separate being that occurs, because that particular wing of psychoanalysis, intersubjectivity theory, that I was speaking to also de-emphasizes the separateness of the individual. And I again feel like that's a limitation in that theory. So I think very important in that way to make sure that's not thrown out. The fact that we become more of who we truly are, right? More of who we innately are, as we realize ourselves as what I'm going to call fundamental consciousness. But also because so many of the teachings talk simply about a non-dual awareness, and they'll even make this sort of gesture, awareness. and it's all out there
Right.
too. You know, once I asked someone, "Can you have a memory as non-duality?" He was really stumped by that, uh, because that out there, this out there is a kind of a frozenness in the present moment, can't go anywhere, and that's misleading. Oneness, I think, obviously, if oneness is just out there, I call that halfness, right? That's just the other half. Oneness has to include our own being, or it's not oneness. People also ask, how can we have a relationship in non-duality? Well, beautifully, we can have a wonderful, rich relationship if both people have realized non-duality, especially because we experience that deep, deep, deep connection. Your internal space and my internal space actually resonates together. It's something that's not often talked about in non-dual teachings. The internal space of the body, when we get to that very subtle aspect of ourselves, has the capacity to resonate with, connect, and even to some extent read the internal space of another body. And we resonate love to love, and we also, of course, can then relate as two unique human beings with somewhat less projection, right? More, more cognizance of what's going on. So I think it's important. And it's important also that we open our whole being. So sometimes what's left out or ignored in teachings that talk about non-dual awareness or talk about just kind of out there clarity of the present moment don't necessarily talk about the transformation that occurs for us, in which we must open our entire being, not just awareness, but everywhere throughout our whole being, in order to know ourselves as part of the oneness.
So I want to, that's beautiful. I want to just ask you something that I read you're in relation to this kind of what I see as sort of a critique of one way of looking at non-duality. And you describe it in one of your articles that it is taught with a punitive attitude. And I was wondering if you mean by punitive that the denial of the self in that context is sort of essentially saying that the self is bad, or that
Yes.
one shouldn't have a self. Is that kind of what you mean?
That's what I mean. And sometimes there's that tone in it from non-dual teachers, which I think just adds, insult to injury. Your feeling, that's no good. That's your small self.
It's a fluctuation. Yeah.
You're thinking of yourself as a child. That's no good. That's your old story. That's not who you are, really. Just eliminating the whole richness of who we are and how we got here, but also that it exacerbates what many of us have already experienced to some extent growing up, right? Don't be so smart, don't be so loud, don't be so powerful, don't be so vital.
Yes.
Don't cry. So be less and less of yourself.
Right.
And so many people hearing the teaching of, if you exist, that's bad. You're, altogether, the non-dual teachings, I think, in this country sometimes get mixed up with a kind of a Western morality too, which I'm not sure it's taught in the East. If you have that self, God won't love you. Well, but we're not really talking about God right now. We're talking about realization. This is not a blessing that falls on us. Realization, if we're good, or if we follow the teacher's orders not to feel or not to think about ourselves at all. It's a realization. It comes from within. It's all of our birthright. All of that.
Beautiful. So I'm glad you're mentioning this about the way that sometimes non-duality is taught, and it sort of resonates with what Paul often says. Paul, my teacher, Paul, who I know you're familiar with, Paul Muller-Ortega, Kashmir Shaivism scholar practitioner, and he often describes this as the difference between the renunciant versus the householder teachings, and that in the kind of, well, he uses a lot of Hindu terminology, but in the Kali Yuga, when things have gotten confused, there's this there's been a confusion of the practices that are appropriate for householders, what we're talking about, householders being people who are embodied, living lives, having selves. And then those have been confused with the renunciant teachings, which are essentially, for monks who are going into where it is appropriate to kind of, dissolve into the ocean of consciousness, because they're living in a monastery up in the mountains where they don't have to organically approach life. So anyway, I just wanted to, I see you have a point.
Yeah, I don't quite agree with that, because the renunciate is just giving him or herself a little more time to realize themselves, and I think the realization itself is limited if we don't experience fundamental consciousness pervading our own form, right? So it's particularly important, of course, if you want to live in the world and not bunk into walls and stuff. But even for the renunciate, I mean, all the more time and focus to be able to have this really mature realization that pervades everywhere.
Yeah, I think that, just to kind of hammer away at that a little bit more, I think that at least philosophically, the idea is that one is sort of approaching Nirguna Brahman, one is approaching Saguna Brahman. So Brahman with form, Brahman with attributes, Brahman without attributes, and yeah, I mean, and then when you get into, of course, Shaivism says that yes, the kind of contentless consciousness of Brahman without attributes is actually kind of a lower sort of realization than the realization where that realization of consciousness pervades everything.
You have to come back from it.
Yeah.
You have to eventually open your eyes. And, as Thomas Merton told us, the hardest thing about being a monk is other monks, right? You're never going to be completely alone, or there's going to be that annoying chipmunk who's always there, whatever, right? You come back from that, objectless state, and there are objects. And
yeah, what do you do then?
Yeah,
this annoying bookshelf.
Right. That's right. The ticking clock or whatever it is. But that that consciousness without objects, that's a state that can, it's an absorbed state that can help us then open more fully, I think, to this state that pervades objects.
Yeah. So let's get a little bit into kind of an overview of kind of the practice of the realization process, which of course is this sort of practice of embodying non-duality. So I know that there's sort of an orientation. There's some practices that are oriented around like the head, chest, and the pelvis. But can you kind of give us some of the fundamental features of the realization process?
Yeah. I mean, kind of one of the things that distinguishes the realization process from other methods of non-duality that do mention the ground and the full realization is that there is practice associated with it. And that's because I have found that if people are simply told, this is your true nature, just sit with it, and that's it, great, that oftentimes people will let go of themselves from a kind of surface of themselves, right? So there is an expansion. It's often an energetic expansion, which I make a distinction in this work between knowing oneself as matter, energy, and the stillness of the ground of fundamental consciousness. So they let go of themselves and they sit. And of course, all that goes along with that kind of teaching, the self-acceptance of life as it is, excellent things, and especially for those of us who grow up wanting to do things right and kind of holding ourselves tight, very, very good, but often does not get to fundamental consciousness itself. For that, it is a letting go, but it's a letting go from deep within us, from deep within the whole internal space of the body, from that very, very subtle channel, Sushumna in the Hindu system, central channel in Tibetan Buddhism, that opens into fundamental consciousness. So in my experience, we need to do a little concentrated focused work, not a whole lot, like not a lifetime, not a whole lot, but a little focused, concentrated experience in order to deepen our inward contact with ourselves and then let go and allow for what is a self-arising, as the Buddhist wonderful term, of that ground of our being, self-arising, completely without volition, completely uncreated, as Shankara called it, uncreated, to allow that to arise, I believe, needs a letting go from deep within the body, not an ordinary mundane letting go.
Mm. So what is the then, is it sort of the same kind of sequence each time, or is the sequence dependent on the client or the practitioner?
Yeah. Well, there's some main practices. There's really two main practices, and that the one is a practice of inhabiting the whole body, attuning to the innate qualities of the body, and there again we're volitionally attuning to something that's actually uncreated, that would over lifetimes arise perhaps naturally, but we're attuning to it, and then we're attuning directly to the pervasive space of fundamental consciousness, and then letting go, right? So that we kind of set up a sort of preparation for that self-arising, which is the actual realization. The practices, of course, are not the actual realization, they're practices. So there's that one practice, it takes about a half hour, of inhabiting the body and attuning to pervasive space, pervading the body and environment, and that takes in also what happens with the senses and so forth as we know ourselves as that ground, as we attune to ourselves as that ground. And the other main practice of the realization process is attuning to that subtle channel that I just spoke of. It's for those couple of listeners who don't know about it, it's a subtle channel that we can find that runs vertically through the torso, neck, and head, and above and probably below the torso. Very fine channel that we can most easily open from into fundamental consciousness once we have found it. And it also opens us into that very, very subtle energy that they do talk about in Kashmir Shaivism, that very, very subtle energy by going into the core, because that's part of knowing ourselves as the stillness of fundamental consciousness, is also knowing us as the most subtle aspect of our energy system. It's actually designed on a spectrum from dense to subtle. But when we know ourselves as the stillness of fundamental consciousness, we also know ourselves as this very, very, very subtle kind of radiance of the space, of the stillness. And that we get to by going into this very subtle channel and initiating our breath within it. So it's a kind of very subtle breathing exercises. Those are the two main exercises, and those are pretty much repeated. Because they're practices, they need to be practiced. They need to be practiced fairly consistently, repetitively. Then there's a lot of other auxiliary practices that come in as people need them. There's relational practices, because we have, as just from our earliest years, set up that protected artificial division between self and other in relation to other human beings. So we can sit on our meditation pillow and open and feel wonderful, and even, feel it pervading the trees and maybe our cat. But as soon as we see another human being, boom, we're back into that divided space. So in the realization process, we do practices directly for tuning to fundamental consciousness with another person. So that's part of it. We also do some gentle movement practices, also for cultivating that inward contact with one's own form, so as to open more fully to knowing oneself as fundamental consciousness.
So those that are, familiar with the chakra system will see the kind of at least loose correlation of head, chest, and pelvis with the chakra, with some some fundamental differences that I've noticed, or some differences. One being the kind of idea, the head focus is not like the third eye or the crown; it's the middle of the head. And I have to say, when I was reading the article where you were describing this, I almost immediately, as soon as I sort of went there, and there was a very kind of visceral buzz that I think I haven't had, and so I'm curious if that just sort of emerged for you in the context of your own practice and exploration, or if that was something that was sort of suggested from another path.
Yes, actually, the center of the head was suggested to me by a teacher that I worked with for about 5 years. He was actually a Rolfer. He wasn't portraying himself as a teacher, because I had this problem in my body. So I went to Alexander Technique, and I also went to this man. His name was Amos Gunsberg. He there was a lot going on there. He was a very interesting person, but he taught me about the center of the head. He did Rolfing with me
Oh,
for
wow.
5 years. You know how you're supposed to do it for
Yeah.
10 sessions? I went for 5 years, every week, sometimes twice a week. Yeah,
Oh, that's intense, Judith.
completely Rolfed. What you see before you, completely Rolfed. So,
Yeah.
but I was a hard case.
Yeah.
So, but he was an extremely perceptive man. He hated anything in the Eastern religions, just despised it. Thought it was all complete nonsense. And we had many good arguments on that as I began to go towards Asian religion. But he taught me about the center of the head, and it was liberating for me, to get there because, like many sensitive people, I, lived smack up against the world like that. And to get that distance and actually feel contact with people and feel safe in my own body, in that distance, in touch with myself, and able to connect with other people. That was really redeeming. It was wonderful. And then later on, I realized that, this actually enters right into fundamental consciousness, which of course Amos didn't talk about, but it does. It enters right into fundamental consciousness. So I use that point. I use the heart chakra. I use what I call the pelvic centers between the second and third chakra. Really, you can go in and do this core breath anywhere along the core. And once you're pretty adept at it, you can do that core breath anywhere in your body,
Yeah.
thumb, right? So, but I do those 3 points just to get kind of the whole core quickly.
Yeah, I think that the head one especially for me was, I mean, I haven't done the other ones yet, but it was quite amazing just how immediate it was, and how, apparent that what you're describing, the distance is. And I sort of wonder if, in the Indian tradition, there's this idea of the chittakash, right? The space inside the head. And often it's described the space just inside the forehead, but I'm sort of wondering if that's actually a more appropriate location of that, what has been described as the chittakash.
Yeah, well, there is an experience of a channel between. I actually work, and not between the brows to the third eye, but a little bit higher. Actually, we can work even a point above that. But there's a experience of a channel between the center of the forehead and the center of the head, which is very interesting to open. And I worked during my time working with Amos. We're still in kind of the late 70s. I worked with a man on the sounds for the chakras. His name was Sham Bhatnagar. I think he's still teaching somewhere. And I worked with him for just a little while, and he was talking about the center of the head. And he said that his teacher in India, he was Indian himself, East Indian. He said that his teacher in India said that the third eye was like a trigger point for the actual sixth chakra, which was the center of the head. Well, I thought that was interesting. So
super interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. So it actually exists somewhere in the Indian systems as well.
Excellent. I'll have to go search for it. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about trauma. And, and I think, obviously, you've just written a book, Trauma and the Unbound Body, which I think is a beautiful kind of term. And so I guess the first question is sort of what is unique about the approach to trauma in the realization process, as opposed to perhaps other ways of approaching trauma?
Yeah, I think the realization process makes two contributions to even to somatic approaches to working with trauma. One is there's a very specific release technique, which is a little bit different than other techniques, and I'm not going to describe it, but it works to recognize and release the exact pathway of the way we've organized ourselves. Mm-hmm. One distinction in terms of the somatic or the body psychotherapy field is that I'm not working with the nervous system per se. I'm really working with the fascia, and I'm working with the fascia in a kind of sophisticated way that, it's just sort of the frontier of fascia work as well, where we think of it as a kind of a collagen matrix that's everywhere in the body. Actually, Ida Ralph herself talked about it that way. So that we can organize ourselves in reaction to our environment from our first day and maybe from even before that, in reaction to the environment through the medium of whatever this level of being is, level of very subtle tissue that seems to interface with the mind, um, and, um, and, and dampen the impact of experience that would otherwise might have a shattering effect on us. So I'm working with what I believe is the fascia, but definitely not just the nervous system. Releasing a certain amount of the fascia, of course, will relax the nervous system. So there's that difference. There's this very specific release technique that works to get into the tension and find exactly the movement of into the constriction and release it. Very much the way that Alexander teacher, her name is Lydia Yohe, taught me so many years ago. Right? Only we can do it ourselves. We don't need someone doing it for us. In fact, I think it's more effective if we do it ourselves. We need to have, so the other contribution I think from realization process in terms of trauma work is when we release, because we have already in the realization process, and I won't do the release technique until people have already done at least those first two practices that I described, that they can be in their body, that they can attune to fundamental consciousness, at least to some extent, pervading everywhere, and that they can access their core, right? That's one, because we need to access the core in order to get a fine enough, precise enough focus into the holding patterns, right? Into those organizations. But the other reason is so that when we let go, we don't let go into nothingness, right? Which can be very intimidating, and will right away, as soon as we leave the therapist's office, establish it again. But sometimes, but rather we let go into this ground of being, right? Into who we are, and we can claim it that way and maintain it. It becomes part of who we know and experience that we are.
So one thing that kind of stood out to me, but I'm not quite sure if I maybe interpret it correctly, but it seemed in one of your articles that you were suggesting that we should be inhabiting our whole body before pervasive consciousness. But then I just heard you say that you inhabit pervasive consciousness and then you approach the trauma. So what's the sequence there? Because I guess initially I was liking that idea of inhabiting the body before pervasive consciousness, because it seems like, what often happens is people leap, to go back what we were talking about earlier, people leap towards that transcendental state as a way of escaping their trauma, rather than kind of working through it first. So what is the sequence there? What is the relationship of the relationship to pervasive consciousness? That relationship. What is the relationship of that relationship to the relationship to the trauma?
Oh, to the trauma. To the trauma work, you mean?
Yes.
The sequence, inhabiting the body and attuning to pervasive consciousness, that's really all one practice, right? We inhabit the body in order to then experience that the space inside the body and outside the body pervading our environment is exactly the same space. Don't make a distinction between those.
Okay.
So we inhabit the body in order to experience that we are seen to be made of fundamental consciousness, that we can experience ourselves that way. So that precedes, I think, should precede the release work of the trauma, because we have the safety of some amount, of contact with ourselves. This is not regressive work. We don't become the child. We actually, with all the present day attunement to the ground, are able to observe and experience that one little bit of ourselves, so that child mentality that actually always seems to still be there within the holding pattern, while the rest of us, these days it's called resource, right? While the rest of us is connected and in contact with present day reality, right? So it's much safer, feels much safer, and it gives us some place to release into.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So then, what is, I guess, a follow-up question to that is, what is one of the dangers of releasing trauma without that sort of backdrop, or without that ground to be safe in?
Yes. So maybe danger is
it's a little
strong word.
Inflammatory.
Yeah, it's not dangerous, and that's not usually dangerous. The danger is that we'll reestablish it.
Right.
We'll protect ourselves again because it's so
There's nothing to fall
scary.
back on.
Like
So, well, yeah.
that's nothing to fall back on. So there we are, just open. I'm just open, but there's no, contact. With a lot of energy is released. My early training was to take a baseball bat, a rubber baseball bat, and hit a pillow as hard as I could and say the worst things that I could think of to say. And that would release a whole lot of energy. I mean, it was great. It was very scary. And it was kind of, there wasn't the cognitive aspect was often missing, which I think is very important so that we know why we did the holding pattern, so that the next time we see that same type of authority figure or whatever, or withdrawn emotional person or whatever it is, that we don't go back into the same holding pattern. And there's a feeling of danger, even though there's no actual danger. Of course, if we're very, very loose, right? If we tend towards mental illness, well, then there is a danger of what we call decompensation. That we'll lose touch with reality if we go too far too fast, and that's very important. That's why it's very important to do this with someone else who's there, and to let the therapist know if you have that in your history, if you're that loose, right? Because the center needs to hold, right? And then we would just simply do much more of the centering work in the body and so forth. So that'd be the only actual danger. But there's a feeling of danger because we made so many of these holding patterns protectively. There's a feeling that if I let this go, my father, who's been dead a number of years, is going to come marching in here and yell at me again, right? And I'm going to be that scared little person again. So, that's a feeling of danger. But when we inhabit ourselves, we have an actual palpable sense of safety, that contact with ourselves, and that unity, and that feeling of our own love, feeling of our own power, personal strength, feeling of our own intelligence, is an actual feeling of safety.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Is there also a sense of the loss of identity here? So, in the way that I've become so habituated to my kind of patterns rooted in certain traumas that I become identified with them, and therefore, without doing the kind of identifying with the ground of consciousness work, that when I lose that identity, it's sort of terrifying, and I have no anchor and no ground for making sense of who I am anymore, and that is one of the kind of fears or that sort of pushes us back into those holding patterns because they're familiar, and that sense, even though they are traumatic, they're comforting.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's a big part of it. Thank you. That's exactly right. And some of our holding patterns actually are kind of masks and identifications, actually specifically that. And those are kind of scary to let on, the mask of being a kind of superior person or being a generous person, all of those that have bodily components to them, holding patterns, but also just the sense of being in a certain shape, a certain holding pattern. And very often people will say, well, who will I be without that? Yeah. But then it turns out that who they are, it's just wonderful.
Yeah. So there was one just kind of passing reference that you mentioned. Well, it wasn't passing. It was in the context of one of the stories or one of the case studies. And I just loved this idea, and I wanted just to hear you kind of elaborate on it a little bit, which was finding each other from the internal space of our bodies, and because it's such a beautiful idea. And so I guess, after we do all of this work of resolving our trauma, the next thing is we're hoping that will be useful in the context of our relationships. So how does that fit in here? What is this, finding each other from that internal space of the body?
Yeah, it's extremely useful in our relationships. As I mentioned, what's often not talked about in non-dual teachings, because I think traditionally they weren't that concerned with relationships, is that the internal space of our body actually has the capacity to contact, to resonate with, and to some extent to read, to actually know the internal space of someone else's body. We can do it across distance. You and I could do it on Skype. We can do it, and and that's it's real contact. Uh, you know, fundamental consciousness, and again, not often talked about in this way, is the basis of contact. When we experience it pervading our body, that we experience that we're made of fundamental consciousness, it feels like we're in deep contact with ourselves. When we sit with another person, and there are several practices in the realization process that go directly to that, sit with another person who has fundamental consciousness, we have an actual sense of contact. Very hard to put into words what contact is, but we know it when we feel it, right? And it's something that we all crave, right? That we're born knowing we want.
Yeah, beautiful. So we're sort of approaching the end of our time together, and despite my tiredness, I think this was a fantastic conversation. I survived. So I guess, to close, is there any sort of, based on what we've been talking about, do you have any kind of closing thoughts or ideas you want to share?
No, I think you covered it very well with your questions. That's all I have really to say about it. Of course, there's more in the books and stuff, but these are definitely the main points. That it's primarily a technique, a method of knowing ourselves as fundamental consciousness, and goes to that let go, no effort way of being, but no effort as that very fine consciousness pervading ourself and everything else. The things are actually transparent. That not that we can see through them, but that we experience them as permeable. Right? Life becomes this fluid, permeable ground. So it's primarily that, and then it has a very, I think, effective application to psychological healing and relational healing.
Mm. So thank you so much for that, Judith. This has been a fantastic conversation. And I guess to close, I would love for you to share a little bit about things that are coming up for you that people might be able to get in on. I know, of course, you have your website, realizationprocess.org, where people can find out more about you, including articles, and there's some media on there. The things that I mentioned, you can find there, the podcast, another podcast interview, as well as a video from the Science and Non-Duality Conference. And I also know that you're participating in Scott Lyon's project next year. I will be there as well. I think
great.
I'm doing some kind of mediating some panel or moderating some panel, so I'm not sure, but I'll find out. But you're going to be there, and as well as Ray Johnson, who I interviewed yesterday, and some number of other people, and that's next October, is that correct?
Yes, October. Somewhere mid-October. I don't have the dates in front of me. I think it's something like 12th to 15th.
Yeah,
something
in San Francisco, correct?
In Berkeley, I believe.
In Berkeley, right. The ugly stepsister. No, I'm kidding. So with that, are there any other things coming up, coming up, like trainings or workshops?
Yes, there's so many things coming up if you come to the website. And now I also have on the website the senior teachers, people who've been doing this work, who trained with me and doing this work for a long time. I'm going to be at the Whidbey Institute on Whidbey Island. Beautiful, beautiful place.
That's near where I grew up.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful. And that's a very intensive retreat, 5 days. And for people who haven't experienced the realization process, it's a good place to start. I'm going to teach every aspect of it. And it's residential and just gorgeous trails and levels and everything. Yeah. So I would suggest that people are interested in the realization process and want to taste it, to try it, that would be a good place to start. But there's also teacher trainings coming up, and all that's on the web.
Excellent. I'm not sure if we mentioned it, but Whidbey Island is in Washington State, my home state, and it's a profoundly beautiful place. So besides the profoundly beautiful experience of realization process, go check out my home state.
Short ferry ride from
Seattle. Yeah, it's just it's just such an incredible place. All right, well, I've been speaking with Judith Blackstone, the creator of the realization process. Judith, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you. I've loved it. Thank you.